On this Thursday night, Judgment Day is on the way for the two Michaels. Trials in China with no witnesses, no transparency.
What you're going to see is a deliberate act of humiliation.
What are Ottawa's options to secure their freedom? Allegations that sexual misconduct is running rampant through Canada's military.
I encourage you to tell your truth.
What's stopping more victims from stepping forward? Big boost. The vaccines coming from our neighbors.
I'll drive down there in my pickup and pick them up if we have to.
Could this signal a reopening of the border and reinflating the Atlantic bubble? Optimism rises over this part of Canada.
Global National with Donna Friesen. Reporting tonight, Robin Gill.
Good evening and thank you for joining us. Tonight, Canadians Michael Spavor and Michael Kovrig are preparing to stand trial. They have spent 829 days in jail in China, accused of spying. The two men were detained separately in December 2018. Their arrests are widely seen as retaliation for the arrest of Huawei executive Meng Wanzhou in British Columbia. Meng was arrested at the request of the United States, accused of violating American sanctions. But the two situations couldn't be more different. She's out on bail, living in a multi-million-dollar home in Vancouver, while the two Canadians have had limited contact with their families and the outside world for more than 2 years. Spavor will be in a Chinese court in a matter of hours. Kovrig's hearing is scheduled for Monday. As Abigail Bimman explains, the timing of the long-awaited trials is likely not a coincidence.
They didn't allow any defense evidence to be presented, so we were completely crippled in that trial.
Peter Humphrey is one of the few Westerners to know what Michael Spavor and Michael Kovrig are facing. He was convicted in a Chinese court in 2014 and maintained his innocence. Now he helps others in the same situation.
You're not going to see a real trial here. What you're going to see is a deliberate act of humiliation, and these two men have actually no real means of defending themselves.
He expects a conviction. More than 99% of Chinese court cases end that way.
Normally be a small number of people in the courtroom, family members, etc. That this is not the case would be due to the fact that this is a national security issue.
Former diplomat Gordon Holden has been in the courtroom when other Canadians were on trial in China. He was hoping Kovrig and Spavor would have a consular presence. Global Affairs says despite several requests, Canadian officials have not received permission to attend the trials and remain deeply troubled by a lack of transparency.
To be absolutely shut out of the court process is simply wrong. I do not believe that it's in accordance with the Vienna Convention on Consular Relations or of the Canada-China consular agreement.
We should be prepared for the worst, but we shouldn't be so pessimistic to draw the conclusion in advance that they will receive guilty conviction.
Lynette Ong is not jumping to conclusions because the case is so unusual and so political. She says the timing is odd, with China and the U.S. meeting in Alaska Thursday. Some believe the Chinese may be trying to use the case as a bargaining chip.
The Americans are in a pretty tight spot. What are they going to do? Are they going to give in to what we call hostage negotiations? Or, on the other hand, are they going to do it because these are two lives at stake?
Michael Spavor's family has largely stayed quiet at his request, but released a statement saying they now feel it necessary to call for his unconditional release, citing a belief in his innocence and a lack of transparency in his case. While Michael Kovrig's wife tells Global News learning about the looming trial is overwhelming to process, but she is continuing to focus on trying to bring him home. Abigail Bimman, Global News, Ottawa.
This all puts the spotlight on our federal government and exactly what it is doing to help the two Canadians. Let's bring in our chief political correspondent, David Akin. And David, I think a lot of Canadians are wondering, why doesn't Canada just trade Meng for the two Michaels?
Well, in fact, a lot of former senior Liberals, John Manley, John McCallum, for example, a lot of former diplomats, they have also advocated just that, a trade. But Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has rejected the idea every time. Trudeau's point is the minute Canada agrees to such a deal is the minute a target goes on the back of every Canadian abroad. Every dodgy regime in the world would know if you want something from Canada, simply throw a local Canadian in jail. And second, even if Trudeau wanted to make that trade, there would be howls in this country that he'd be interfering in the independent Canadian judicial process now dealing with Meng's case. And of course, aside from showing that Canada was a nation of laws only if convenient, it would also be politically dangerous for Trudeau because, remember, the Liberals took a big hit in the polls for alleged interfering in the SNC-Lavalin case. Robin.
So, David, what has the government done so far, and what more can it do?
The government has actually done quite a bit, though most of it is behind-the-scenes diplomatic activity. The two Michaels have been a constant topic in just about every meeting or phone call Foreign Ministers Freeland, Champagne, and now Garneau have had with any international counterpart. And that work culminated this spring in the first ever global treaty banning arbitrary detention. The entire G7, including the U.S., signed on to that, and I'll tell you what, it very much got China's attention. The goal for Canada here is to get its allies, like the U.S., constantly telling China that China's hostage diplomacy is counterproductive, that China's standing in the world will be diminished, and that China is holding back its own economic success. Robin?
David Akin in Ottawa. Thanks, David. Turning now to allegations of sexual misconduct in the military. One of the most senior women in the Canadian Forces spoke to Global News about her personal experiences and why she's walking away. In part 2 of our exclusive interview, Lieutenant Colonel Eleanor Taylor talks about the harm associated with reporting the abuse and why it's so important to end the silence. Here's our Ottawa Bureau Chief, Mercedes Stevenson.
Lieutenant Colonel Eleanor Taylor is a warrior. She willingly signed up to take on threats to Canada. But the silent, insidious enemy within, she didn't expect. Now she is speaking out about what she believes happens to most women in the Canadian Forces and why women are afraid to break rank and report.
The consequences of being alienated by the group are greater than the consequences, in some cases, of whatever inappropriate sexual behavior we are dealing with. And so we choose to manage the inappropriate behavior and never report.
For the first time, Taylor is revealing her own experiences to highlight the problems in the system and encourage other women to speak.
I've told my story many times, but I have never shared the fact that I too have struggled with this behavior, because in so doing, I feel that I risk the reputation of the team and risk alienating myself from the team.
The potential pain of being ostracized in that way is almost seen to be worse than the pain of dealing with the sexual misconduct or the sexual violence.
I had instances where I experienced either highly inappropriate sexual behavior. An example started during my training, when my very earliest training, where we had an instructor who had a relationship with one of the 17-year-old students, where we had an instructor who would get drunk and make inappropriate advances. I have had an experience where somebody that was a significantly higher rank than me earlier in my career insisted that I go to his room with him. And when I arrived there, he sat on the bed and turned on pornography. And in that case, I chose not to report because I knew that by reporting, I would bring myself far greater harm that was not worth the cost.
Taylor says the culture in the military has to change. Otherwise, women like her will continue to leave.
I think it has a significant impact on the longevity of women and victims who are not women in uniform. Because you can take this behavior and deal with it for a few years without recognizing the cost that it has on you personally.
Lieutenant Colonel Taylor is encouraging other women to speak. She believes that now is the chance for change in the institution that she loves so much she was willing to give her life and her career for. Mercedes Stevenson, Global News, Ottawa.
Canada is getting a big vaccine boost from the U.S. The White House says it will lend Canada 1.5 million doses of the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine. In January, Ontario Premier Doug Ford appealed directly to U.S. President Joe Biden to send vaccines to Canada. Today, he's grateful our neighbors are willing to help.
Oh, God bless America. They're coming to our rescue. Thank God. I've been bugging Trump. I've been bugging Biden, all of them. They must get sick of Doug Ford asking for help.
The Biden administration is under pressure from allies worldwide to share vaccines, particularly from AstraZeneca. Our Washington Bureau Chief Jackson Proskow is following these developments. So why is the U.S. willing to share now?
Well, Robin, there's a couple reasons. Even though, as you mentioned, the vaccine is widely approved around the world, it is not yet approved for use here in the U.S. In fact, there are 7 million doses just sitting in a warehouse unused right now. And so until the FDA greenlights the AstraZeneca vaccine here, the U.S. has decided to share. And at the same time, the U.S. has enough doses of other vaccines that it doesn't really need this one. There will be vaccine for every American by the end of May. But perhaps the bigger impetus in all of this is the border closure. It has been nearly a year since non-essential travel between Canada, the U.S., and Mexico was cut off. The White House believes that bringing the pandemic under control everywhere is key to getting the borders open again. Now, the final terms of this agreement are still being hashed out, but the White House has described it as effectively a loan that will eventually have to be repaid in vaccine doses somewhere down the line. It's worth noting, though, that both Canada and the U.S. have purchased way more vaccine than they actually need. The issue right now really is more just about availability, enough supply. And so this vaccine loan is essentially about making doses available sooner for Canadians. Robin?
Jackson Proskow in Washington. Thanks, Jackson. And there's more optimism with Canada's vaccine rollout. Procurement numbers show there are more than enough doses coming to have every Canadian receive their first shot by the end of June.
Hopefully, we will be in a spot, in a few months, and where every Canadian will have received, if that's what each jurisdiction is moving forward with, that one dose, and then obviously also being able to offer that second dose.
Today, Europe's health regulator declared the AstraZeneca vaccine safe and effective. There were concerns when a small percentage of people suffered blood clots after they received the shot. That prompted more than a dozen countries to suspend the use of the vaccine. As Crystal Gomansing reports, the vaccination campaign is back on track.
Use the vaccine. It's effective and safe. That's the message from the European Medicines Agency.
Its benefits in protecting people from COVID-19 with the associated risks of death and hospitalization outweigh the possible risks.
France, which is seeing a record high number of COVID-19 patients in its ICUs, was one of more than a dozen European member states to suspend the use of the AstraZeneca vaccine. There were safety concerns following reports of blood clots.
The number of thromboembolic events reported after vaccination is lower than the expected in the general population, and PROC has concluded that there is no increase in the overall risk of blood clots with this vaccine.
The EU's drug watchdog says it will dig further to understand the reports of some rare conditions following vaccination, specifically 7 cases where there was clotting in multiple blood vessels and 18 cases of clots combined with bleeding in the brain.
If it was me, I would be vaccinated tomorrow. But I would want to know that if anything happened to me after vaccination, what I should do about it.
The European Medicines Agency is recommending an update to the drug information leaflet, and it's highlighting some potential signs to watch out for, such as breathlessness, pain in the chest or stomach, swelling, or coldness in an arm or leg. Belgium didn't pause its rollout, and those being jabbed had no hesitation.
I spoke to my daughter, and he said it's a very good vaccine.
I have a great confidence in the vaccine. Why not? AstraZeneca is a good vaccine.
It's expected many of the countries that halted its use will put it back into rotation. Crystal Gomansing, Global News, London.
The new alarm in Saskatchewan's capital city. Coming up, the race to vaccinate Regina as dangerous variants spread. The number of people testing positive for those highly contagious variants is climbing in Canada. According to the Federal Public Health Agency, more than 4,200 variant cases have now been confirmed. A vast majority, more than 3,900, are the B117 variant first identified in the UK. Ontario is bearing the brunt of these mutated forms of the virus. It has the most cases of the variants compared to other provinces, but those variants are taking hold in much of Western Canada. Nearly all of Saskatchewan's new COVID-19 cases are from the B117 variant, and they're concentrated in Regina. As Roberta Bell reports, there are calls for more restrictions.
Certainly the fact that we're the hot spot in the country does make me concerned.
A year ago today, everyone was thinking it was going to be over in 2 weeks.
In the early days of the pandemic, there were proportionally very few COVID cases in Saskatchewan's capital. For a period of weeks last spring, there were actually none at all. But now, public health officials say they're watching Regina closely.
2 weeks, 3 weeks ago, we couldn't predict where the variants of concern would take over. Right now, they've taken over in Regina.
There are 527 active COVID cases in Regina. 489 of them, 93%, are confirmed or presumptive variants of concern. This epidemiologist warns it won't stay local for long.
We are seeing a surge in Regina, but it will soon be seen in other communities in Saskatchewan as well.
In fact, as of Thursday, Saskatchewan reported a total 568 confirmed or presumptive variant of concern cases, making up 44% of the province's 1,282 active cases.
The nature of this pandemic is now pivoting to a more threatening, a more dangerous phase.
Regina Mayor Sandra Masters says she's watching the situation closely.
My offer was we're prepared to do anything that the Chief Medical Officer is thinking will be necessary.
Restrictions in Saskatchewan relaxed last week to allow expanded household bubbles of up to 10 people.
Regardless of what you're allowed to do, just because you can doesn't mean you should.
While Regina residents aren't facing any new public health orders, provincial officials say vaccines are being diverted to them in a race against the rapidly spreading variants. Roberta Bell, Global News, Regina.
Still ahead, new rules for medically assisted death, why advocates for the most vulnerable are worried. There's new hope tonight for Canadians suffering with intolerable pain. A bill expanding access to assisted death has received royal assent. Those who aren't near their natural death now have the right to seek medical assistance in dying. But as Heather Yerkes West reports, some groups feel the new law puts some vulnerable Canadians at risk.
Janet Hopkins has been living with a serious autoimmune disease for the last 13 years. She says she lives in constant pain.
Since last February, I have been thinking of suicide. I've talked to my family about it because the pain is excruciating when you get a flare-up.
Because her condition was not life-threatening, Hopkins had not been eligible for a medically assisted death. But with the passing of Bill C-7 on Wednesday, that all changed.
I started to cry because I've wanted this for so long.
Under the new law, intolerably suffering Canadians who aren't near death become immediately eligible. It also removes a requirement that patients be able to give final consent at the time of their death.
And that's wonderful because what's happened in the past is many people have had to opt to take their death early in order to avoid that situation because they were at such fear and risk of losing capacity.
The government had until next week to bring the law into compliance with a 2019 Quebec Superior Court ruling that found Canada's previous law was unconstitutional. In 2 years, access will also expand to those suffering with severe mental illness, something opponents worry will put vulnerable Canadians at risk, particularly those from Indigenous communities, where mental health supports can be difficult to access.
It sends a culturally and socially acceptable message that suicide is one option to end one's suffering, and that is contrary to our message that we're sending to our youth.
The new law requires people not facing imminent death undergo a 90-day assessment before a medically assisted death can be accessed. Heather Yerkes West, Global News, Calgary.
Up next, Atlantic Bubble 2.0 and why there's a burst of hope. The exclusive Atlantic travel bubble is making a comeback. Round 2 is expected to begin in April, once again allowing locals only to move freely while restricting outsiders from visiting. A spike in COVID-19 cases in November burst the bubble, but as Ross Lord reports, with vaccinations on the rise, there's renewed hope in this part of Canada.
For Atlantic Canada, re-establishing the Atlantic bubble is a show of confidence.
I think that everyone has been wanting to see opportunities to travel throughout our region.
The bubble imploded in November after a spike in COVID-19 cases, forcing people to self-isolate if they traveled outside of their own province.
2 weeks there and then to come back and isolate for another 2 weeks. And it's just too hard. It's difficult to take that amount of time off to make a trip to New Brunswick.
It's been tough on Kathleen Armstrong and tough on her mother, Grace.
No matter if they're 5 years old or 30 years old, they need their mom and dad. They like to share their news.
Especially this news.
My fiance, Brad, and I got engaged the first weekend in December.
They're itching to celebrate the ring in person.
It's an exciting time. I'm waiting to actually see it and feel it and touch it and all that.
Travel restrictions will ease on April 19th. Talks are also underway about allowing visitors to enter from outside the Atlantic region.
I'm pretty confident that, when we put this behind us, I think all of Atlantic Canada is going to jump up a notch or two in everybody's list.
Excitement is already building.
It was instantly a phone call to Mom, like, they're saying this date and we've got to get on the road and I'm calling boutiques and you need to look at hotels and tell my sister to take time off of work so she can come too.
New hope that a return to normal is getting closer. Ross Lord, Global News.
And that is Global National for this Thursday night. I'm Robin Gill. We'll stay in the Atlantic for tonight's Your Canada, which is Chelton Beach in Prince Edward Island. We would love to see your corner of the country, so please keep sending your photos to viewers@globalnational.com. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you back here tomorrow. Have a great night.